This video. This is part of a reading series, Saturday Success, reading Awaken the Giant Within by Tony Robbins. And this is such a great book. It's about how to take immediate control of your mental, emotional, physical, and financial destiny. And ultimately, it's really about what you want to achieve. And I know this sounds weird, most people say, "Oh, what is a book about?" People want to know what it talks about. But what I think this book is really about is you, the person. I think it was written from Tony Robbins to the reader, and it's ultimately about you and what you want to achieve, what you want to do in your life, what you want out of your mental, emotional, physical, and financial life. And he does cover the topic of spiritual, but not so much. I think he does not necessarily dive into that. But that is a part of life that he mentions a few times. And with that said, the mental, emotional, physical, and financial destiny that all of us want, our destiny, the things that we want to create out of our lives. And, most people like to think of destiny as, like destiny, this is fate, this is what I have to do. And some people see it as like, hey, I am destined to be great, and then they pursue that with all of their energy and everything. And then others might say, oh well, I'm destined to like not succeed. And whether you believe in the truth of a single path in life that you're destined to go toward, right? Like that your future is already predetermined, whether you believe in that or not, it's good to consider if there is something that you want to achieve, if there's a destiny that you wish to hold in your life, what is that, and how do you go towards your, I don't want to call it ultimate purpose because that sounds a little too high up there, right? But what you want out of your mental, emotional, physical, and financial life. So with that said, without explaining too much of what I think this book is about, let's dive in. So we were just in the previous video in this series, we were talking about 6 steps to creating a long-term change. And there was 3 steps. It started with deciding what you really want and what's preventing it from you from having it right now. Getting leverage, which is associating pain to not changing or massive pleasure to changing now. And 3, it was interrupting any sort of limiting patterns. So finding ways to interrupt those limiting thoughts. And finally, we are on number 4 here. Create a new empowering alternative. So, NAC, Neuro-Associative Conditioning, Master Step 4. Create a new empowering alternative. So this 4th step is absolutely critical to establishing long-term change. In fact, the failure by most people to find an alternative way of getting out of pain and into the feelings of pleasure is the major reason most people's attempts at change are only temporary. The failure by most people to find an alternative way of getting out of pain and into the feelings of pleasure is the major reason most people's attempts at change are only temporary. Many people get to the... Well, let's look at that because that's bolded. So what does that really mean? The failure by most people to find an alternative way of getting out of pain and into the feelings of pleasure is the major reason most people's attempts at change are only temporary. Oh, so the reason why most change is temporary is because they fail to find an alternative way of getting out of it. So if you're constantly going into bad habits or having challenges with those limiting beliefs, you simply haven't found an alternative way to get out of the pain and into the feelings of pleasure. So that's a big one right there. Now to continue, it says, many people get to the point where they have to change, where change is a must because they link so much pain to their old pattern and they link pleasure to the idea of changing, they even interrupt their patterns. But after that, they have nothing to replace the old pattern. Remember, all of your neurological patterns are designed to help you get out of pain and into pleasure. These patterns are well established, and while they may have negative side effects, if you've learned that a habit can get you out of pain, you'll go back to it again and again since you've found no better way to get the feelings you desire. If you've been following each one of these steps, so these patterns are well established, and while they may have negative side effects, if you've learned that a habit can get you out of pain, you'll go back to it again and again since you found no better way to get the feelings you desire. So if you have a habit and if you feel that it can prevent you from feeling more uncomfortable, you'll go back to it. If you've been following each one of these steps, you've gotten clear about what you wanted and what was preventing you from getting it. You've gotten leverage on yourself. You've interrupted the pattern, and now you need to fill the gap with a new set of choices that will give you the same pleasurable feelings without the negative side effects. Once you quit smoking, you must come up with a new way or a lot of new ways to replace whatever benefits you used to get from the old behavior. The benefits of the old feelings or behaviors must be preserved by the new behaviors or feelings while eliminating the side effects. What can you replace worry with? How about massive action on a plan you have for meeting your goals? Depression can be replaced with a focus on how to help others who are in need. So here's a really interesting thing right here. Really just this idea of, why are we going back to our habits? Habits are ultimately, based on some of the ideas from here, are ways to avoid other discomfort, or we get so much pleasure out of the habit that, we can avoid these other discomforts that we're having. And this can range from something as simple as probably nail biting, if people consider that a bad habit, to, picking at your nails, or smoking, or something even much worse, such as maybe going back to a bad relationship, or something that affects your work in the workplace, like not following up with customers, or just activities that are harming your ability to do work, things like that. And those are some things it's important to consider, like, how do I get into better habits? And the answer, according to this, is you simply haven't found enough things that move you into a pleasurable state, so you fall back to the comfort habit. If you're not sure how to get yourself out of pain and to feel pleasure as a replacement to your smoking, drinking, worrying, or other undesirable emotion or behavior, you can simply find the answers by modeling people who have turned things around for themselves. And I think this is great because social media has so many people. As I started to get into running, and I ran my first marathon recently, I find that there's so many people on social media. One man who runs ultra marathons now, and he was talking about how, he used to chase money and he used to chase like the comfort feeling of food, but now he's running ultra marathons. So he has like these before and after pictures where he was obese, he was unhealthy, to his standards, his current personal standards, and he starts running ultra marathons. An ultra marathon is anything over 26.2 miles, which is a regular marathon. And I met quite a few people who had drug addictions, and they turned to running, and that helped them get out of it. Now, I'm not saying running was the sole thing that they did. Some of them found religion, some of them found probably mentors, some of them even had a rehab. So, just in consideration of these different things people did, it's interesting to think that they found activity, sport, physical fitness as their escape from, as a thing that made them feel better than how these other addictions made them feel, or these other habits, right? So there's addiction and then there's habit. They're not necessarily in the same category, but I'm sure that there are people who apply these ideas in a similar way. But with that said, a good example of this is Tony Robbins. So I'm reading this. This is my friend Fran Tarkenton. When Fran and I first started doing my personal power television shows together, he had a habit that truly surprised me. He was addicted to chewing tobacco. I'd be in a meeting with Fran and suddenly he would turn his head and spit. This did not match my picture of this powerful and elegant man, but he'd been doing it for over 20 years. As Fran would tell me later, chewing tobacco was one of his greatest pleasures in life. It was like his best friend. If he was on the road and felt alone, he could chew tobacco and he wouldn't feel alone anymore. In fact, he told a group of his friends one time that if he had to choose between sex and chewing tobacco, he'd chew tobacco. How's that for a false neuroassociation? He'd wired a pathway out of pain and into pleasure via the highway of chewing tobacco. After years of continual use and reinforcement, he had created a neural trunk line from tobacco to pleasure. This was his favorite route of change. What got him to change his behavior? Finally, he got enough leverage on himself. One day, with a little help from a friend, he began to see that chewing tobacco was massively incongruent with the quality of man he had become. It represented a lack of control over his life, and since being in charge of his life is one of Fran's highest values, that was a standard he could not break. It was too painful to be in that position. He started to direct his mind's focus to the possibility of mouth cancer. He pictured it vividly, until pretty soon he was driven away from the idea of using tobacco. The taste of it started to disgust him. These images helped him to get leverage on himself and interrupt the pattern he'd previously linked to using tobacco for pleasure. The next most important key was that Fran found new ways to get pleasure that were even more effective than tobacco. What could those possibly be? He poured himself into his business like never before and started producing results that have made his company, KnowledgeWare, one of the most successful computer software companies on Wall Street. Even more powerfully, now that he needed a new companion, he decided to attract a real one and found the woman of his dreams and learned to get the kinds of emotions and feelings from his relationships with her that he could never get from any other source. Often, if we just break our old patterns enough, our brains will automatically search for a replacement pattern to give us the feelings we desire. This is why people who finally break the pattern of smoking sometimes gain weight. Their brains look for a new way to create the same kinds of pleasurable feelings, and now they eat mass quantities of food to get them. The key, then, is for us to consciously choose the new behaviors or feelings with which we're going to replace the old ones. Isn't that interesting? Before we move on to this next section here, I think this is such a powerful example because there could be very successful people. There could be very successful people who by all appearances, and we've heard these stories, right? People who look happy, social media, but deep down, they're struggling. Deep down, their relationships are not as bright and happy as social media likes to appear because whatever. And we hear about those stories all the time. But I think it's until, we have someone close to us, someone that we talk to on a regular basis, or maybe even acquaintance that we hear a lot about, like the truth about their lives, that we start to realize the humanity in people's habits, the humanity in people's negative habits, and it might range something from something that we might consider harmless, like nail biting, to something that mostly harms ourselves and our closest neighbors, such as smoking, to probably even our relationships, right? To worse things, which we're not going to dive into here because the scope of this video doesn't really cover that. Those are good things for therapists and other stuff, real people who work with those types of things. But as far as being our best selves, right? What are the things that are holding us back? Is it our lack of a diet, or our lack of a healthy diet, or our lack of healthy eating, I should say, because DIE is the biggest part of the word diet. No wonder why people want to avoid it. That's actually a quote from Tony Robbins. But with that in consideration, why are we doing the things that we do? I think that this book does a great job of answering those questions. What are these patterns that we can replace? when it comes to eating healthy, working more effectively? Like, what are the whole habits that are holding us back from doing more at our jobs? Or if we aren't focused on our jobs and we want a life beyond our jobs, what are the things that are holding us back from living that lifestyle? Is it just work? Is it just, these hundreds of hours that we put in per month at our jobs? Or, is it something else? Right? So that's a really good question. Sometimes you don't know. Sometimes you don't realize it until, you hear a story from somebody else, or you actually work directly with someone who's able to help you pinpoint it. Like, I think in this situation, right, it says that Fran wanted to, find a new relationship. He wanted to find other ways. But what if the trigger wasn't all of those things? Yes, those things help, but what if it was being in the presence of simply Tony Robbins, this person who helps people change, being business partners with him, and realizing that, in those circles of like the high performance circles, that chewing tobacco is not really like, he doesn't live up to the image that he wants to live up to in those circles. So I think there's a lot there that is also not covered that can really affect someone deep down. So maybe it does come down to changing your circles. As far as habits go, I mean, we hang out with the same friends. That's a habit too. And sometimes those relationships can be harmful. Sometimes your direct family can be a part of an unhelpful habit. So with that said, continuing on, studies and transformation. A statistical study was conducted by researcher Nancy Mann to evaluate the level of rehabilitation in reformed drug abusers. And the adoption of a replacement behavior appears to play a major role, even in this complex field of change. Wow. The first group in the study was forced to give up their addiction through some external pressure, often applied by the legal system. As we talked about in the section on leverage, external pressure rarely has a lasting impact. Sure enough, these men and women returned to their old habits as soon as the pressure was lifted, i.e., as soon as they were released from jail. A second group truly wanted to quit and tried to do so on their own. Their leverage was primarily internal. As a result, their behavioral changes lasted a great deal longer, often as much as 2 years after the initial commitment. What eventually caused a relapse was suffering a significant amount of stress. When this occurred, they often reverted back to their drug habit as a way of getting out of pain and into pleasure. Why? Because they had not found a replacement for the old neural pathway. The third group replaced their addiction with a new alternative, something that gave them the feelings they had sought originally, or perhaps something that made them feel even better. Many found fulfilling relationships, spiritual enlightenment, a career that they could be completely passionate about. As a result, many never returned to the old drug habits, and the majority lasted an average of over 8 years before any backsliding occurred. The people who succeeded in kicking their drug habits followed the first 4 steps of NAC, and that's why they were so successful. Some of them lasted only 8 years. However, why? Because they didn't utilize the 5th and critical step of NAC. So before we get into that big step, I think it's a really interesting idea to consider this concept right now of these addictions based on this research. I mean, this is super powerful. Like, I'm talking, these are like really serious drug addictions. And I can't say I've ever had an experience with that personally. And, I've had friends who have. And, I think it's really interesting to think that if you can help someone kick a drug addiction, right? Like, for you watching this video, I don't know what challenges you're facing, what limiting beliefs you have, what habits you want to change, what goals you want to pursue, but something's holding you back, that you keep falling back to like something, whatever that is. If, this research provides evidence into helping drug abusers, some who have been in and out of jail, what does that mean for us, for most anybody who has an internal motivation towards something, and and they don't necessarily have like a super serious issue such as drugs. Like there's so much potential there, right? So there's just so much potential from these steps, and I want to summarize these just to consider. So obviously the first group, right? Study external pressure, jail, punishment, reprimand, whatever. Those don't work, and you fall back into it as soon as there's the pressure's lifted. That's quite a powerful idea. The second, true motivation. You have hunger, you have desire, but as soon as something happens that's extra stressful, not knowing how to like cope with that situation, you just fall back to your habit, right? The habit of the situation. And the third group, replace the drug addiction with an alternative. And that's a huge question right there, right? For them, whatever their alternative was, for drug addiction is super serious, but for the rest of us, what is the alternative that we need to create in order to create the goals, the life, the destiny of our lives that we desire? That's such a great question to come out of this book. So NAC, Master Step 5. We're going to continue here. And I want to summarize the last paragraph before this one. It was, the people who succeeded in kicking their drug habits followed the first 4 steps of NAC, and that's why they were so successful. Some of them lasted only 8 years. However, why? Because they didn't utilize the 5th and critical step of NAC. NAC Master Step 5. Condition the new pattern until it's consistent. Conditioning is the way to make sure that a change you create is consistent and lasts long term. The simplest way to condition something is simply to rehearse it again and again until a neurological way is created. If you find an empowering alternative, imagine doing it until you see that it can get you out of pain and into pleasure quickly. Your brain will begin to associate this as a new way of producing this result on a consistent basis. If you don't do this, you'll go back to the old pattern. Now, I do have a question here in consideration of this is, for 8 years, I feel like over 8 years, they had to have conditioned something. So I hope he answers this question. That's a question that's lingering on my mind, but let's see what he says. If you rehearse the new empowering alternative again and again with tremendous emotional intensity, you'll carve out a pathway, and with even more repetition and emotion, it will become a highway to this new way of achieving results, and it will become a part of your habitual behavior. Remember, your brain can't tell the difference between something you vividly imagine and something you actually experience. Conditioning ensures that you automatically travel along the new route. That if you spot one of the off-ramps you used to take all the time, now you just speed past them. In fact, they'll actually become difficult to take. The power of the conditioning can't be overestimated. I read recently that Boston Celtics great Larry Bird was doing a soft drink commercial in which he was supposed to miss a jump shot. He made 9 baskets in a row before he could get himself to miss. That's how strongly he's conditioned himself over the years. When that ball hits his hands, he automatically goes through a pattern that is aimed at putting the ball through the hoop. I'm sure that if you examine the portion of Larry Bird's brain that is linked to that motion, you would discover a substantial neural pathway. Realize that you and I can condition any behavior within ourselves if we do it with enough repetition and emotional intensity. The next step is to set up a schedule to reinforce your new behavior. So I want to circle this right now. Neural pathway, any behavior within ourselves, repetition and emotional intensity. The next step is to set up a schedule to reinforce your new behavior. How can you reward yourself for succeeding? Don't wait until you've gone a year without smoking. When you've gone a day, give yourself a reward. Don't wait until you've lost 80 pounds. Don't even wait until you've lost a pound. The minute you can push the plate away with food still on it, give yourself a pat on the back. Set up a series of short-term goals or milestones, and as you reach each one, immediately reward yourself. If you've been depressed or worried, now each time you take action instead of worrying, or each time you smile when somebody asks how you're doing and you say, great, give yourself a reward for already beginning to make the changes necessary to ensure your long-term success. In this way, your nervous system learns to link great pleasure to change. People who want to lose weight don't always see immediate results. Usually losing a couple of pounds doesn't miraculously transform you into Elle Macpherson or a Mel Gibson. So, it's important to reward yourself as soon as you take some specific actions or make any positive emotional progress. Like choosing to run around the block instead of running to the nearest McDonald's. If you don't, you may find yourself saying, okay, I've lost a pound so far, but I'm still fat. This will take forever. I have such a long way to go. Then you might use these short-term assessments as excuses to binge. And that's such an interesting thing of, there's a couple ideas that I find here that are really, really interesting. First, I'm going to tackle this part, him taking the mind of somebody, and he says, if you don't, you may find yourself saying, okay, I've lost a pound so far, but I'm still fat. And I think it's interesting because, no one would ever accept someone else calling them fat. But I think on some level, people who do have problems with weight, deep down, they call themselves names, right? Like we all do. We all take our biggest insecurities and our biggest doubts and our biggest fears, and we highlight them in our own minds, but we would never allow someone else to say those things to us. And that's a really interesting idea, and I liked how he phrased that, in the other person's perspective. But at the same time, when you've gone a day, really patting yourself on the back. There's a lot of successful people or super hard workers, right? The hustle 24/7, you got an A now, strive for, an A plus or whatever in school, right? Super type A. And they might have gotten to where they are using that type of mentality, but, at some level, I think that personally, they were rewarded with that. But at the same time, most people, especially if you're trying to break a bad habit and you're trying to move into a future or if you want to move into a future that's more productive, more, having greater financial, mental, emotional, and physical success, it's a great thing to consider how you can reward yourself immediately. Have rewards, celebrate. And how do you celebrate without falling back, right? I think that's a big idea. I know in some running circles, they like to run and then they like to go drink beer. And that's a fun thing, right? Whatever, that's cool. That's all good, right? But for those people that like drinking, who took on running for physical fitness, and then suddenly they're going back to avoid drinking, but then suddenly they go back to drinking, they celebrate with just one beer. I mean, that's cool, whatever. I mean, as long as they feel great about it. But at the same time, what if that's just a cheap way to reward yourself, right? And this is just a thought about hey, that's just an easy way. Let's just give these people beer. Who doesn't like beer? But at the same time, what's another way? What are some more effective ways to reward yourself? Maybe treating yourself out to a nice dinner, or I don't know, going to buy yourself some new running shoes or something, right? Those are some other ways to reinforce. And this is just my thoughts on that idea, running for beer. I think it's interesting. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but if you wanted to avoid beer and you're jumping into running, and then you're getting into beer again, then who knows? I mean, does it really help you? But anyway, to continue on, understanding the power of reinforcement will speed up the process of conditioning a new pattern. Recently, I had the pleasure of reading an excellent book that I highly recommend to those who really want to make a thorough study of conditioning. It's entitled Don't Shoot the Dog by Karen Pryor. This book sets forth some simple distinctions about modifying animal behavior that parallel my own distinctions gained in years of shaping human behavior. What's fascinating is how similar animals and humans are in terms of the forces that drive our actions. Knowing the fundamentals of conditioning enables us to take control of those forces and create the destiny of our choice. We can live like animals, manipulated by circumstances and those around us. Or we can learn from these laws, using them to maximize our fullest potential. Pryor discusses in her book how she learned to utilize pain to train animals for years. Whips and a chair for lions, the bridle for horses, the leash for dogs, but she ran into difficulty when she began to work with dolphins. Because when she tried to give them pain, they just swam away. They caused her to develop a more thorough understanding of the dynamics of positive reinforcement training. That's pretty interesting. And I think that's really eye-opening to come from someone who did use the negative ways. And I don't even know, I feel like today she would almost be considered like an animal abuser. But I think it's powerful to at least have those examples today, and to know that there's much better ways to take care of animals. There's nothing training cannot do. Nothing is above its reach. It can turn bad morals to good. It can destroy bad principles and recreate good ones. It can lift men to angelship. Mark Twain. The first organizing principle of any type of success conditioning is the power of reinforcement. You and I must know that in order to get ourselves to consistently produce any behavior or emotion, we must create a conditioned pattern. All patterns are the result of reinforcement. Specifically, the key to creating consistency in our emotions and behaviors is conditioning. The law of reinforcement. Any pattern of emotion or behavior that is continually reinforced will become an automatic and conditioned response. Anything we fail to reinforce will eventually dissipate. We can reinforce our own behavior or someone else's through positive reinforcement. That is, every time we produce the behavior we want, we give a reward. That reward can be a praise, a gift, a new freedom, etc. Or we can use negative reinforcement. This might be a frown, a loud noise, or even physical punishment. It's crucial for us to understand that reinforcement is not the same as punishment and reward. Reinforcement is responding to a behavior immediately after it occurs, while punishment and reward may occur long afterward. That's some powerful stuff right there. I think it's interesting, as I've driven for Uber, and Uber has this really funny way when you get reported by a client for they say you drive too fast, or you didn't do something that they liked or something. And it's interesting because they don't tell you who said it, and I get it, they want to protect the riders or whatever, but at the same time, it's this doesn't reinforce anything. It's literally just a punishment, a weird way of punishing people, because all it says is, oh hey, a rider said you were speeding, and then that's it. It says to read the rules of the road, and it doesn't tell you who. It doesn't let you know when you were speeding. You don't even realize it. So it's interesting because it says reinforcement. You got to do it right away. You need the feedback right away, and that's really how you get people to improve. And I think at some level, this is an obvious example with dogs. You can come home. Most people think oh, they come home, they rip the pillow, show them the pillow, and shove their nose in it. I don't think most people do that anymore. And that's a terrible way to train a dog or teach a dog. But I think some poor trainers, bad dog owners have learned to do that, and because they haven't learned better ways to do it. Because the dog has already done the activity, and just shoving it in their nose, they don't always understand, right? But if you can either yell at a dog, and that's probably not the best way either, right? That's negative reinforcement the moment that it happens. Or, I don't know, spray them with water. Some people do that for cats, but I mean, there's extreme people who might even say spraying a cat with water in order to get them to not do something is like poor training. I think it's okay personally, but with that said, there's probably even better ways, which I've seen on television. Some trainers will say like condition your dog to focus on something else, right? So if they're like distracted by all these things in the road and they're like constantly barking at people, one of the things you can do is find a way that keeps their focus and attention on you and the walk. This is just like the basic, right? Whether it's a treat or a toy or whatever it is, so that you don't have to worry about punishing and yelling at them or spraying them with water for the bad behavior, which might even like reinforce it in some way. Like they associate barking with water, and if they don't mind water, then they're just gonna keep barking. So that said, just some things, and of course now we're moving into this human idea, right? Like if you yell at somebody for something that they did in the past, it doesn't really help, right? Then it just becomes an argument of, well, you're just keeping track. You constantly keep track of all the things that I've done or whatever, right? You probably had those arguments or discussions. But if you can address it in the moment, that's how much more powerful can that be, right? Just some ideas that stem from this idea of law and reinforcement. So there's definitely a lot of truth in there. And with that said, we're moving on to this section. Timing is everything. Appropriate timing is absolutely critical to effective conditioning. If a coach yells great when the basketball team executes a perfect pick and roll, it has a lot more impact than if you waited until they debriefed later in the locker room. Why? Because we always want to link sensations of reinforcement in the pattern that is occurring. One of the problems with our judicial system is that when people commit criminal acts, they are sometimes not punished until years later. Intellectually, they may know the reason for their punishment, but the pattern of behavior that generated this problem in the first place is still intact. It has not been interrupted, nor does it have any pain linked to it. This is the only way to truly change our behaviors and emotions long term. We must train our brains to do the things that are effective, not intellectually but neurologically. The challenge, of course, is that most of us don't realize that we're all conditioning each other and shaping each other's behaviors constantly. Often we're conditioning people negatively instead of positively. So here's what I think is interesting is in acting, there's different types of teachers in acting class, and it's just an example which I think is really powerful from here. And part of an acting job, a great acting teacher's job, is to not just like teach you what you have to do, but I think a better acting teacher, their job is to help you break the habits of bad acting and to help you develop the habits of great acting. And I find that in different teachers. They do it in different ways. And one teacher that I have, who I think is a great teacher, you'll read books. If you ever read like acting books, you'll find like in different actor teachers, they'll do like a class, and then someone will record all the conversations in the class, and you'll find that like in the middle of a scene, like 10 sentences in of a scene, the acting teacher will be like suddenly cut, stop, what are you doing? Not what are you doing, but you need to do it this way or whatever. And I think that's really powerful, because I think that shows a deep understanding of what it takes to cut bad behaviors. Because I think the actor, right, they don't want to be interrupted. They want to continue their scene. They're like, I was just getting into it. But a good teacher or a coach, this could be in any area, like a good coach in football, basketball, or just being a good parent, or being a good pet owner, right? Interrupting these things as soon as they happen and like reinforce. I guess the term is reinforcing. Like as soon as something happens, reinforcing whether it's bad or reinforcing whether it's good. And I found a great example through acting, great acting classes. So here we go. That is the only way to truly change our behaviors and emotions long term. We must train our brains to do the things that are effective, not intellectually, but neurologically. Ooh, that's powerful right there. Not intellectually, but neurologically. So not discussing it, having a discussion after something has happened, but having the thought to instantly be like, hey, we need to talk about this right now. The challenge, of course, is that most of us don't realize that we're all conditioning each other and shaping each other's behaviors constantly. Often we're conditioning people negatively instead of positively. A simple example of this occurred with my daughter Jolie's ex-boyfriend. Jolie was very busy with school, dance, and a play she was in. He wanted her to call him every single day, and when she missed a few days and then called him, he gave her tremendous amounts of pain. He clearly wanted her to call more frequently, yet his strategy for reinforcement was to badger and berate her when she did call. Have you ever been guilty of this? If you want your boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse, or significant other to call you more often, how effective do you think it would be to nag them to call? When they finally do call, do you greet them with statements like, oh, you finally picked up the phone? Will wonders never cease? Why do I always have to be the one who makes the call? What you're doing is training him or her not to call you. You're giving pain right after they do the very thing you want. What will happen as a result of this? Pain will be linked to calling you. He or she will avoid it even more in the future. In Jolie's case, this pattern was continuous, going on for months until Jolie felt that she couldn't win. If she didn't call, she'd get pain. If she did call, she'd get pain. As you might guess, this pattern of negative reinforcement permeated many aspects of their relationship, and eventually the relationship ended. If you truly want someone to call you, then when they do call, you need to respond with delight. If you tell them how much you miss them, how much you love them, how grateful you are to talk with them, do you think that they'll be more inclined to call again? Remember, link pleasure to any behavior you want someone to repeat. And that can be difficult too. Because in a moment, we're upset about something that happens in the past. In this example, he was upset that she didn't call him in the past. That, we bring up that we're like reacting to those things as opposed to reacting to the specific moment of what's happening. And, that could be all sorts of different reasons, right? Like, it might not just, it ultimately comes down to like what you want to reinforce. So with that said, in my consulting with companies across the United States, a bigger example here in the workplace, I've noted that most companies try to motivate their employees by using negative reinforcement as their primary strategy, trying to use fear of punishment as its prime motivator. This will work in the short term, but not in the long term. Sooner or later, companies will run into the same problems that Eastern Europe has. People will live in fear for so long before they revolt. The second major strategy companies use is financial incentives. While this is an excellent idea and is usually appreciated, there is a limit to its effectiveness. There is a point of diminishing return at which all the additional incentives don't really induce a greater quality of work from people. In fact, most companies find that there's a limit to what they can do in this area. If one constantly reinforces with money, people begin to expect that when they do something of great value, they must have an immediate economic return. They begin to work strictly for financial reward and won't do anything unless they get it, surpassing and stripping the capacity of the business to keep up with the economic demands of its employees. The third and most powerful way to motivate people is through personal development. By helping your employees to grow and expand personally, they begin to feel passionate about life, people, and their jobs. This makes them want to contribute more. They do it out of a sense of personal pride rather than pressure from the outside. This doesn't mean you shouldn't have an incentive program. Just make sure you have the most powerful incentive of all, which is to help people expand and grow. This is such an interesting idea because I really think that if you were to just present this one idea to a business, if you were just present this one idea by itself to someone, like if I was just to say, what is the most powerful way to motivate people? in a workplace and I was to just say this, people would just like shrug it off. They'd be like, oh, I know that. Oh, that's cool. Yeah, sure, whatever, right? And then they'd go on, they continue to give financial incentives. But the fact that this has been included almost like basically in the middle of this book or like the first quarter after many, many examples, I think that really adds to the power of this and the important value of this concept that, you know, help people grow, help people to expand, help people to have more passion about life and their jobs, and that will ultimately help them contribute more. Good and evil, reward and punishment are the only motives to a rational creature. These are the spur and reins whereby all mankind are set on work and guided. John Locke. Schedule your reinforcements so change lasts. When you're beginning to establish a new behavior or a new emotional pattern, it's very important that you reinforce yourself or anyone else you're trying to establish these new patterns for. In the beginning, every time you perform the desired behavior, for example, pushing a plate away with food still on it, you need to give yourself acknowledgement, pleasurable reinforcement of a type that you will truly appreciate and enjoy. However, if you reinforce the behavior every time thereafter, eventually your rewards will no longer be effective or appreciated. What at one time was a unique and enjoyable surprise will become an expected norm. Because of my commitment to help those in need, whenever I go through airports, I invariably give to those who request money. I'll never forget one particular gentleman who had staked his claim in a particular spot in front of a terminal I frequented. Every time I came by, I gave him some money. On one morning, I was very rushed and I had no money in my pocket. As I walked quickly by, I smiled and said, "Hello, I'm sorry, but I don't have any money today." He became angry because I was no longer giving him something that he once was thrilled to receive from me. You and I need to remember that the element of pleasant surprise is one of the most enjoyable experiences that a human being could have. It's so much more important than most of us realize. This is the very reason why, if you want a behavior to last long term, it's invaluable that you understand and utilize what's known as a variable schedule of reinforcement. That's interesting. If you want it to last long term, you have to have a variable schedule. Let me give you a simple example from dolphin training. Back to the dolphin training. I'm glad he got back to that. In the beginning, to train a dolphin to jump, trainers wait for the dolphin to jump on its own. They catch the animals doing something right and then reward it with a fish. By doing this each time the dolphin jumps on its own, the dolphin eventually makes the neural association that if he jumps, he'll get a fish. This pairing of pleasure to a behavior that the trainer desires allows the trainer to condition the dolphin to jump again and again. Eventually, though, by slowly raising the standards, the trainer can shape the dolphin's behavior. Here's the key. If the dolphin is always rewarded, he may become habituated and will no longer give 100%. So in the future, the dolphin is rewarded sometimes after the first jump, or perhaps after the fifth, or after the second. A dolphin is never sure which jump will be rewarded. This sense of anticipation that a reward may be given, coupled with the uncertainty as to which try will be rewarded, causes the dolphin to consistently give its full effort. The reward is never taken for granted. This is the identical force that drives people to gamble. Once they've gambled and been rewarded and linked intense pleasure to the reward, that excitement and anticipation pushes them to go forward. When they haven't been rewarded in a while, often they have an even stronger sense that this time they'll be rewarded. What drives the gambler is the possibility of winning again. If a person were to gamble without ever receiving a reward, they would give up. However, receiving just a few small rewards, winning just a few hands, earning back just some of their money keeps them in a state of anticipation that they could hit the jackpot. This is why people who discontinue a bad habit like smoking or gambling for a period of months and then decide to have just one more hit are actually reinforcing the very pattern that they're trying to break and making it much more difficult to be free of the habit for a lifetime. If you smoke one more cigarette, you're stimulating your nervous system to expect that in the future you'll reward yourself in this way again. You're keeping that neuroassociation highly active and in fact strengthening the very habit you're trying to break. Oh, that's pretty crazy. So back to the beer example, I think this is powerful. Like the earlier discussion about beer and running. There's like running and then like a bar hopping after your run. They do that a lot, or like reward yourself with beer after a run. I think that's a good way to invite people who love to drink into running. And beer. I think beer on a controlled basis is not harmful, but I think for people who like love beer and almost too much, who like move into a state of like, I gotta get fit, let me go run, and then I could drink beer afterwards. I don't know. I mean, I think this helps to answer that ultimately strengthens your addiction to beer. But if it gets you to run, and you get like physically fit, your body becomes healthier, and it's not harming you in some other way, or anybody else, then hey, who's to say, right? But if it's a habit you're trying to break, if you're trying to get into running to break the habit of like drinking, and you want to use the reward of beer to you're reinforcing it. If you want to reinforce a person's behavior long term, you may want to utilize what's known as a fixed schedule of reinforcement. In her book, Karen Pryor describes training a dolphin to make 10 jumps in order to make sure that the dolphin consistently jumps 10 times. You'll want to reward them on a 10th jump each and every time. You can't demand too many behaviors before reinforcement occurs. But if the dolphin is rewarded only on the 10th jump, the dolphin soon learns that it does not need to make as great an effort on the previous 9 jumps, and quality declines. This is the same reaction we might see in people who receive a paycheck every 2 weeks. Employees know there are certain things expected of them for which they receive regular compensation. The challenge is that many people learn to do only the minimum necessary to receive the reward because there's no surprise. In the workplace, pay is expected, of course, but if it is the only reward, then workers will do only what is expected and the minimum they can do for the pay. However, if there are occasional surprises like recognition, bonuses, promotions, and other perks, then they will put forth the extra effort in hopes and anticipation that they'll be rewarded and acknowledged. Remember, these surprises must not be predictable, or they become ineffective and taken for granted. This expectation will drive the behavior. Vary your rewards and you'll see greater results in making change within yourself or anyone you're managing. There's a third tool for reinforcement that can also be used. It's known as a jackpot. A jackpot can help you to compound the reinforcement. If, for example, once in a rare while you give a dolphin not only the fish, but 3 or 4 for its behavior, it makes the dolphin anticipate even more. That if it just puts that extra effort, there might be a huge reward. This compels the dolphin to consistently give more of itself. Human beings respond similarly. Often in companies, when people are given a reward that's much greater than anticipated, it can create great motivation to continue to give great service in the future with the anticipation that they may receive an even greater reward. The same principle can work like magic with your children. Create a jump start. The jackpot principle can also be used with someone who's not motivated to produce any results whatsoever. Holy crap. Here we go. So, what do we do with someone who's unmotivated to do something? Again, if dolphin trainers have an animal which they seem to be unable to motivate at all, they will sometimes give it a dozen fish, even though it has done nothing to earn it. The pleasure that it creates creates sometimes enough to break the dolphin's old pattern and put it into a state of such pleasure that it then becomes willing to be trained. Again, human beings are similar. If someone who seems to not have done anything right is suddenly given a reward, just out of compassion and caring, this can stimulate them to take on new levels and types of behavior and performance. Wow. That's pretty cool, huh? So, I mean, from my understanding, this is new to me, right? This is new information to me because I've always been under the impression, and when I say always, I would say most of the time. But it is really interesting. Like, to think, if someone's totally unmotivated, someone lacks motivation, someone's not doing well, someone is like, you know, and you might think, oh, well, I shouldn't reward that behavior, right? If you've thought about this stuff before, if you've considered some of these ideas, if you've heard it in the past, what can you do to reward them? Just out of nowhere, right? Like no one really thinks about that, because it can come from a lack of compassion, a lack of caring, and you might be so focused on like only reward positive behaviors, or only punish negative behaviors, or like only reinforce when I get in the moment. But most people can really miss this. And although he doesn't really share like examples, I think I can think of it with my cats, or my girlfriend's cats, which I've adopted in some form. But with that said, it feels good to randomly give them treats. Like I'm not on a regular basis thinking like, how can I train them, right? Because cats are very difficult to train for people who are not skilled in that area, and I'm not skilled in that area. But with that said, I definitely notice that they react differently when suddenly I start giving them like just a lot of treats, catnip treats, multiple times a day, and they change. And I don't think they're motivated to like do anything like spectacular, like jumping, but I can see it. I can literally witness their energy levels change if you surprise them with treats. And I guess I don't want to apply this to humans now, suddenly saying like humans are like cats, but I could say on my own career, at one point I was working at a tech company, and I had gotten comfortable in tech company. I started to lose a little bit of motivation, and the rewards weren't as great as they were. Like I'd reached the financial like peak. I wasn't able to get a raise, and in the role that I was in, you can really start to get into a habit, a motion of the ocean, rather than creating your own waves. And at one point they were like, hey, why don't you go do this, go do some recruiting, try this other role, and we're gonna send you to travel to colleges and go talk to students. And I was like, whoa, that's cool, that's pretty awesome, that's wow, y'all think that great of me? Wow, I feel motivated, I feel inspired. And at first I thought it was like maybe I was really like a high performer, right? Like our ego, our confidence, our overconfidence wants to say that, but maybe at some level they knew something like this. Like, how can we help the employees who can have potential, which is almost every employee. If you're working at a tech company, you go through an interview, they look at your resume, you probably started with great motivation, and then how can you hire or how can you motivate and inspire a high potential employee? You give them something to live up to, right? And I wouldn't say I was lethargic or unmotivated. I was still motivated, but I felt stuck, right? So that felt like a reward to me, something to live up to. And I think that's a good example here. I can imagine most of us can find a time when suddenly maybe our parents are like, hey, let's go to Disney for no reason other than you just being you, even though all you do is just sit there and play video games, right? Or whatever. I mean, I'm just making up an example, right? Video games, who cares? Some people, whatever people want to do that makes them happy. But from a parental perspective, if you want to motivate your kids, and you come from a perspective of, well, let me just reinforce good behavior, reinforce good grades, and punish negative grades, and they're not doing anything good and they're not necessarily doing anything bad, what can I do, right? And it might come from this answer. Suddenly giving just a random reward, giving them something to do, taking them out, whatever that is. And there we go. So I just think I went on a tangent there because I think that's such a powerful idea that most people don't think about, myself included. Now, to continue on, the most important thing to remember about conditioning, however, is to reinforce the desired behavior immediately. The minute you find yourself responding playfully to what used to frustrate you, reinforce yourself. Do it again and create even more pleasure. Laugh a bit. Remember, each time you create a strong emotional feeling, either positive or negative, you're creating a connection in your nervous system. He's mentioned this concept behind neurological connections versus intellectual connections, and I think that's super important there. So that's why I highlighted that. I'm highlighting this word nervous system. If you repeat that pattern again and again, visualizing the same imagery that makes you feel strong or makes you laugh, you'll find it easier to be strong or to laugh in the future. The pattern will be well established. The minute you or anyone you want to reinforce does something right, create an immediate reward. Reinforce it consistently with the kind of reward that you or that individual personally want or desire. Give yourself the emotional reward of turning on your favorite music or smiling or see yourself accomplishing your goals. Conditioning is critical. This is how we produce consistent results. Once again, remember that any pattern of emotional behavior that is reinforced or rewarded on a consistent basis will become conditioned and automatic. Any pattern that we fail to reinforce will eventually dissipate. Now that you've accomplished the first 5 steps, let's go to the final step, NAC Master Step 6. So we're going to put a wrap on this and we'll continue that in the next video here. But I really want to read through that. I think it's important, a quick summary, this idea of, you got to reinforce it immediately. You got to condition to create the consistent results. And I want to reread this jumpstart section again. Create a jumpstart. The jackpot principle can also be used with someone who's not motivated to produce any results whatsoever. I think this goes back to this concept of gambling. Like, I've definitely gone to a casino before, and I can lose casino, and you play for a little bit. I'm not like super voracious about it, but it's fun, right? You have to plan. They say that if you plan to have fun rather than trying to win money, you can do much better. But this concept of motivation, how jackpots, literally the word itself, how jackpots affect us, right? Like, if you win some money, even though you've already lost $1,000 and you put in, but you made like 200 on the last jackpot, doesn't that like just amaze you? Doesn't that suddenly like wake you up? That's pretty wild. Even though you're down still 80%, you can still feel good about yourself. Again, if dolphin trainers have an animal which they seem to be unable to motivate at all, they will sometimes give it a dozen fish, even though it has done nothing to earn it. The pleasure that this creates is sometimes enough to break the dolphin's old pattern and put it into a state of such pleasure that it becomes willing to be trained. Again, human beings are similar. If someone who seems not to have done anything right is suddenly given a reward just out of compassion and caring, this can stimulate them to take on new levels and types of behavior and performance. Now, it's good that I read it again because you really got to consider, like, my example, I felt like I was doing well. I just maybe personally felt unmotivated, but on another level, I don't know if a company would really send someone who's not performing well, who doesn't seem motivated, to suddenly go do recruiting because they need a motivated face. But good to consider, like, what are some ways that you can reward someone out of compassion or caring to suddenly, spark something within them? What is that? A huge reward, a multiplied reward, a jackpot. And, test it out. Jackpots are not that expensive. In this example, 10 fish, 10 times the amount of fish. If you're trying to motivate a kid to do their chores, and again, I'm at this point, I'm just sharing ideas. If you're trying to get a kid to motivate fish, how can you apply this jackpot principle? Multiply their allowance. I don't know, because it might make them feel like they need to earn it back or something. Or if you have an employee that's feeling unmotivated, that might be tough because you don't want to give a financial reward to someone, because then all the other employees are going to be like, oh, what did he do? He doesn't do anything, right? Especially if it's obvious. But what's an incentive? What can you give them? A medal? Can you give them a sticker, right? If they're a sticker, will that make them? That'll probably offend them. But highlight something that they have done in the past to show recognition and like make a big deal out of it. If you're trying to get your a family member, someone you really care about, motivated and inspired again, how can you reward them? Take them on a trip somewhere inspirational. It doesn't have to be money. I guess money is involved with taking them on a trip, but invite them to a dinner for no reason other than them being themselves. Or if you're managing someone, or you're managing someone, how do you motivate someone who's like unmotivated? I think that when I say managing, I mean more in the sense of like, if you're like managing an artist, like a musician or something, I guess find a way to reward them for no reason other than being a great artist, whatever. Okay, so those are just some ideas, throwing those out. And I guess with that said, we will follow up with this with an NAC Master Step 6, the final step in how to condition yourself to the behaviors that you want out of yourself. And I say behaviors out of yourself, I mean like, at the core of who we are, it's our behaviors. The things that we do, the way we go about things, how we pursue pleasure and pain and all these things. So how do we do it? What is the very final step here? And that will be answered here in another video. But with that said, take a look at this book if you don't want to wait. Awaken the Giant Within, some amazingly powerful stuff here. And thanks for tuning in. Have a great Saturday.